Hi everybody, Richard Tromans here again at Artificial Lawyer TV. Today we're doing another special product demo. This time it's Summize, and to tell us a bit more about it is CEO Tom Dunlop. Hi Tom.
Hello, Richard.
So actually I'm going to disappear as is usual, and Tom is going to give a brief introduction. Then we're going to do the walkthrough, and then I'll come back briefly at the end to do a bit of Q&A. So please take it away, Tom.
Thanks a lot, Richard. And as you said, so I'm Tom. I'm the kind of founder and CEO at Summize. And by way of background as well, I am a former lawyer, or still a lawyer, and very much worked in-house for a number of years, which led to the use case of Summize. So I guess in terms of what we do, what we've kind of recognized, or what we know, and particularly from my background working with contracts, certainly day to day, that contracts are essential to business. They are often considered a blocker. And I think really where we've come at the approach of dealing with contracts is that kind of lack of understanding of what's in the contracts, and also even how to interact with them. So it's founded by myself and a very good software engineer, Dave. And essentially we work across the full contract lifecycle. And I'll go into the kind of way that we do that shortly. So problems, again, that we kind of looked at as when we're looking at developing the products. The general sense is that everyone understands that contracts are important, and we recognize that they're getting longer and more complicated over the years. And actually the name, obviously, Summize, comes from the ability to try and create a meaningful summary of a contract. So that was where the kind of original use case came from. And I think also on top of that, we recognize that the processes that surround contracts are also quite slow and manual. So that's instructing your in-house legal team. And just generally, it feels very manual and slow. And that's kind of slowing down the deal velocity or the sales cycle. And that leads into the final point, which is what we recognized quite early on, and certainly going through the pandemic, which is that essentially, we believe that software needs to live where the users do. There was this big kind of establishment of the virtual office, which happened over the pandemic, whether it be Teams, whether it be Slack, whether it be Office 365. And our approach is very much not to create this kind of all-in-one platform, but very much to kind of plug into those everyday tools, but to make sure we get the functionality you need from a high-level CLM. So in terms of what we do, this is kind of an image we use to visualize, I guess, the three different areas. And we kind of come and approach it from a create contracts, review contracts, and manage contracts. And we kind of use that Teams and Slack application as the kind of front door to be able to create contracts, review, and manage them. The core of the product was born from that kind of AI-powered summary. So we can create those kind of instant summaries of contracts. And really that's kind of to get that critical data outside of them. But also the powering those workflows where you can see some of the key things that we suggest, which is you can create a contract in less than 2 minutes through Teams and Slack, or you can do that first pass review of a contract, whether it be in Microsoft Word or using our web app, in under 5 minutes. Or from a management perspective, we want to really resurface that kind of actionable intelligence, the data, so that you can get to what you need within 2 clicks. So they're the kind of big, I guess, success metrics that we measure the product on when we're developing new features. And we believe, and this is kind of intentional, that we are probably the only solution where we deliver a very native experience in Teams and Slack. And that's what we'll go through a little bit today, about how we can show how you can create contracts in Teams in particular, and how you can then use that as kind of a legal front door. So if I just exit the presentation, so what we're going to run through first of all is from the kind of create aspect of the product. We're going to create a contract in Microsoft Teams. The idea of this is that certainly for business users in whether it be sales teams or commercial teams, can kind of build contracts or create contracts dynamically themselves by answering a few short questions. So what you'll see on the screen is my Teams environment, as most people will recognize. On the left-hand side, we have our kind of Summize assistant. So the Summize assistant allows you to do a couple of different things, but here we've got creating a contract and reviewing a contract. If I just press create a contract, it will then tell me what templates I have available, which is very much governed by the legal team to make sure you only see the templates that you're allowed to create. In this instance, we have things like the one NDA, for example, which we've got in there, but I'm going to choose a supply of services example, as it gives a few different variations about the kind of responses you can give. So I'll select that contract type. It will then take me through a little bit of initial guidance to make sure I've got the right contract that I'm drafting. And then it will take me through a series of questions. So we have some kind of intelligent fields. So for example, in this instance, we're asking for the start date. So I'll give today's date as a start date. We can then link into basically our global company database. So we have integrations basically to search, whether it be Companies House or from the US or around Europe, we have those integrations to those company databases. And it means that when you're searching for a supplier, you can be sure that it is the actual registered entity name. So in this instance, I'm just going to write Facebook, for example, and then it will give me a kind of list of the relevant entities that I have. In this instance, I'll use Facebook Inc. I've got the US and UK kind of databases live here. Confirm that that's correct. And then it'll ask things like charges. So I will just put in a figure of 50,000, and then it will request the contract is created with that information. So there are other kind of dynamic fields that we have. You can do things like playbook entries. So for example, if you wanted to choose between a fixed term contract or a rolling contract with notice, you select an option, like I want option 1 or option 2, and it will then basically draft the contract based on your options. So it dynamically creates it. So I've now built that contract as a PDF. I've been sent to it by email. You can get it in Teams if that's the preference, but I'll just show you what I've received. So this has kind of built the contract based on kind of Facebook Inc. and obviously the charges. Throughout the contract, there's been additions to it as well in terms of clauses that we've selected based on the answers. And it then basically means that the actual contract itself, the business users in particular don't touch, they don't get to edit the Word document, but at the same time, so you can control, always make sure it's the latest version of the contract that they get to edit. And it's just a very easy, simple way for a user to create a contract all within Teams natively, but with those guardrails. From there, you get in the web application, just to kind of explain the other ways you can create it. You can create the contract in Microsoft Word. We have a Microsoft Word add-in, which we'll cover in a minute, as well as you can create it in the web application through the kind of Create tab as well. But definitely the Teams and Slack way is the most popular for the product. So you've created the contract. The next bit was kind of review. So if you want to establish that kind of legal front door, again, we use Microsoft Teams as the way to centralize the requests for reviews for legal. So in this instance, I'm going to type in review. That'll then recognize, okay, you want to review a contract. If you attach the contract to the chat, so I'm just going to drag and drop the PDF version. It's just given the file name. Going to drag and drop the PDF version that I actually just created in Microsoft Teams into the chat. It will then ask me, do I want to attach any linked documents? So this might be order forms, schedule of works, addendums. You can attach them at the same time. We'll do one summary across all of those linked contracts. In this instance, I'll just say no. And then what we can do is kind of triage the request. So you can set this up by user group. So you can kind of say, well, if I get a contract from a salesperson, for example, I want to ask these questions. So I'll do a standard response that a salesperson might give, which is that the deadline was yesterday. The commercial terms, so I'll say well, it's £50,000. And then length of the contract, I'll just say it's 12 months. And then what the other party does, I'll say is digital marketing services, for example. Are they both correct? Yes, they are. And then that will then send the information to Summize. So instantly, as soon as we get off Teams and go into our instance here, you'll see that in the review tab, we now have a contract processing, which has been sent to Summize. We're then going to do a summary of that contract, first of all. And then once we've done the summary, we'll then notify your Teams channel that you want. So in this instance, we've got a contract review requested where we've got kind of the relevant answers to the information. You can either download the original and do a contract review in Microsoft Word, which I'll show in a second, or you can view it in Summize, which will take you to this screen here. If you click on a particular document, it will kind of take you to the summary, where the summary is the left-hand side and the right-hand side is the contract. And by clicking on the result, it will take you to the relevant section of the contract, but you'll see that we've done a summary of the contract already. You can refine the summary as you go through it and kind of add comments, add red flags. You can preset red flags as well. And then from here, you can also share, export. We do a Q&A, so we turn the clauses into a Q&A, which I'll show you as part of the manage, which is basically a more user-friendly way of showing the summary. But again, I'll cover that in the next step. From here, from the requests, you can also assign it to individuals, so almost like a matter management, very easy to use way of assigning it to users, also changing statuses between, we've got things like pending review, awaiting approval with a third party, and it becomes your almost to-do list of contracts that you need to review. Once you've marked them as completed, so you've done the review, we also measure the turnaround time. So we can measure the SLA turnaround time, and we have a load of analytics that support that. So we can look at SLA turnaround time by individual in your team, SLA turnaround time by who requested it. So for sales, for example, and we can also look at how many are at each contract status across the board. So you have quite a lot of intel into how well are you performing in turn around those contract reviews. So one of the areas I mentioned as well is that if that contract request comes in, you don't actually want to do a red flag review or a very quick high level review. You want to do a markup. You can quickly switch over to Microsoft Word. And what we have in Microsoft Word is our Microsoft Word add-in. So you'll see the Summize logo on the top here. This gives you a few options, which are very similar to the web application with the kind of create and review. If I go to review, I can run that exact same summary. So I'll select services supplier, for example, and that will summarize this contract instantly on the right-hand side. And again, it will take me to the relevant sections in the contract based on the kind of results that I found. And it presets those red flags that you saw in the main web application. The other advantage of this is that we not only find the information and maybe red flag it, but we also incorporate the playbook. So by playbook, we mean internal guidance, precedent clauses, and it kind of gives you that guidance as to, well, now we want to do a markup. If I click on the playbook, it will then say, well, what is this clause that we found? And also, how should I go back? So we can incorporate different precedent clauses that you can then basically input and do a markup directly from this right-hand side, or just use it as that guidance as you're doing your markup of the contract. As well as having the playbook kind of very contextual to that clause, if you did just want to access your other playbook, so if I go to my NDA, for example, and I just want to see what my confidential information definition is, I can just access all of that, almost information library on this kind of right-hand side. So that's the review. And essentially there you can manage all your inbound requests. You can do red line reviews. You can do red flag reviews. Once it's signed, we have an integration into DocuSign. So you can send it via DocuSign just to show roughly how it kind of comes back in. This is a kind of DocuSign inbox that we can configure. And essentially there, each envelope that comes back in, if you click on the relevant contract, it kind of gives you what's in the envelope. And then you can decide to kind of decide which is the master contract, which is an addendum. You can change the label essentially gets attached to those linked contracts. You can also delete documents that are part of that envelope that you don't want to summarize. But the idea is here, we receive those inbound requests from signed contracts. You organize them how you want to organize them and push them to a relevant folder in manage. And that will then do the instant summary. So we connect to DocuSign through that route. So finally, we've kind of briefly touched on the created and contract mainly around Teams. You've done the review. You can do that in both Microsoft Word and in the web application for that kind of red flag review. And you've received the contract from Signature, and then we can file it in our essentially repository, our contract repository, and manage. So we've got this set up very much as a sort of regional in-house legal team department that might have different regions that they manage the contracts for. So I've got kind of UK, Europe, Australian contracts. We have this high-level dashboard, kind of what's inside the folders, the key risks in terms of red flags. And also, if you drop down the quick kind of analytics here, we can also look at things like upcoming calendar dates. So we automatically extract kind of calendar dates, including notice periods, and we can build them into a calendar, which gives you notifications via email. You can do it via Teams, and you can also configure it so that different people get notifications by folder. So from here, I've got a kind of a few actions that I can press, but if I drill down into a particular folder, so I go to my UK contracts, I'm just going to go to my legal. And this is then a list of all the contracts I have in my repository, and they're separated by the type of contract on the top. Now, what we mean by type of contract is essentially a list of clauses. You select, we have a lot that comes with the platform, but you can design them all yourself. It's very easy to set up. And essentially that means that whatever contracts you put against that type of contract, that tab will always summarize the same information. So if I just go to a supply of services, this is kind of one of the ones we looked at before. And I see on the left-hand side, I've produced a summary. We can extract things like dates, numbers, currencies, or we can just give you a summarized version of what it says. So some of these have things like there just is an indemnity and red flag. Or you can extract the actual figure, such as the kind of $10 billion liability cap that we've got here as well. What we alluded to before is that we like to, we understand that certainly business users might not want to see a full summary of a list of clauses. So what we can also do is turn that list of clauses into what we call insights. Now it's basically a Q&A where you can say things like, how do I get paid? Well, the answer to that is the charges clause, like $1 billion, but then also you should pay that within 14 days, for example. This is great not only to present this one-off summary to a business user or to a third party, but if we go back to our kind of headline dashboard at the top, I can also use these to find those bits of information out from the search. So from here, if I just click the search open, I might want to know, how do I get paid? In this instance, I'm going to look for Dr. Evil. And it will then say, well, we've got 28 contracts with Dr. Evil, and you can look across all your contracts with that particular party and look at the answer to the question, which is how you're going to get paid from that particular supplier. You can also look across all of your contracts to kind of have a look at, well, how many of my contracts have a particular clause? This has been obviously with COVID, we had this a lot where you might have looked for force majeure, for example, and it will look across, say, well, there's 52 contracts, and you can get a table of all those contracts in one view as well. And then the final element in terms of looking across your contracts holistically, as well as those kind of individual summaries that we create, is that we have analytics that we can run. So we automatically capture this information. So things like payment terms, if you've got a payment terms clause and we're extracting the duration, so 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, we can pull averages across contract types. And that shows you the minimum, the maximum, and then also if you click on show all, it will then actually go through each individual contract and say how that compares to the average. So you've got a number of analytics from a quantitative perspective in terms of looking at raw data, how is a particular contract performing against the average, as well as the more, I guess, qualitative side, which is that Q&A kind of insights-driven summaries that we create. So that's the kind of main bulk of the product, certainly covering the, I guess, the contract lifecycle, the contract flow from the creation in Microsoft Teams, the review where you submit it through Teams and you can do the different options, and then how we can kind of store those documents, extract the information, and then reuse that information in a few different ways. But I think the key really with us, and certainly we appreciate there's a lot of contract tools on the market, is that kind of integration with those existing tools. We very much can track that contract lifecycle through that existing tech stack rather than trying to create this all-in-one central place where people go to kind of manage their contracts.
Gotcha. Thanks, Tom. Really interesting. And just to clarify, so would you or wouldn't you describe Summize as a CLM?
Yes, we have very much, I think when our roots started with summaries of contracts, and I think that's where the initial use case came from. But certainly within the past, I'd say at least 6 months, we have very much bolted on this additional functionality to be full CLM. So yes, we're very much a CLM provider.
Gotcha. Thank you. And so, like, let's say if someone's looking at this, they work in-house and they think, okay, this looks very interesting, I would like to have this. How do they bring it in? How do they implement Summize?
So they would essentially, we have a couple of different license models. So we have it's a software as a service subscription. But essentially, we would you can have a legal user, or you can have business users. We try and keep it quite simple with these two license levels. And typically, what we see is you would get your kind of legal team license, which gives you access to obviously everything and being able to control all the templates. And then we have a much obviously cost-effective business user that you can scale, and they would then interact with the product through things like Teams and Slack as the front doors. We have those two license levels based on a subscription.
Gotcha. And just the last question, in terms of integrations, I mean, if someone's working in-house and goes, well, actually, I really like what Summize can do, but we don't really use Teams that much. We just use fairly basic Microsoft Outlook and so forth. We don't use Slack. Can they use Summize, or do they have to have Teams or Slack?
No, we very much integrate with like Outlook, for example. You can push documents from Outlook into Summize from that route as well. And obviously with the integrations with things like Microsoft Word, we would still support that. And then obviously Summize as a web application can be used kind of standalone for something those signed contracts. The Teams and Slack element is definitely a kind of business user play to try and at scale get people to adopt a product that they're already familiar with. But we have a number of customers that use the functionality that we have across, not just Teams and Slack.
Fantastic. Thanks, Tom. Well, that's all we have time for today, but thank you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.